Earlier this year, February 2018, I was sitting in the airport in Rome. I was by myself and I felt content. I felt at peace. And I wanted to figure out why. I wanted to be able to figure out how I can teach other people to feel this level of contentment at peace. So I started writing down the monumental moments of my life where I took a pivot, a turn, a change, and something that was really uncomfortable that helped me grow, something I was proud of. And all of these moments, I was trying to reverse engineer and see, well, what led up to these moments? What caused this? And I was shocked because every single one of the moments where I was the most proud and grew and stretched all led back to the exact same thing. Grief and immense emotional pain and loss was the catalyst for the biggest growth moments of my life. So I wanted to figure out, well, what did I do? How did I transform this grief into growth? And I realized I used the exact same process for each one of those growing opportunities, those growing moments. It started with forgiveness, and then went into vulnerability, and finished with courage. And this ongoing cycle of forgiveness, vulnerability, and courage has been sprinkled throughout my entire life. Because grief is so much more than losing a person. Grief can be a divorce. Grief can be losing a job. Grief can be any time we lose something that once was that no longer is. I wasn't supposed to wear that earring, I guess. And so with each of those experiences I had, I went through that same cycle. And so I started to dive deeper into, well, what exactly happened? I lost my grandmother to lung cancer. She was diagnosed, and within 2 weeks, she passed. It was so sudden, it was so quick, and I was angry. I was mad. I had so many emotions of, why? The doctor said she had it for 6 months. Why didn't we know? Why wasn't I more involved in her life? All these different questions that always led to the exact same thing, either guilt or blame. And so until I was able to forgive myself, forgive the doctors, forgive the situation, forgive her, forgive all of it, I wasn't able to feel unstuck from that grief and that pain. It was like I was living my life with my back turned to it. And until I forgave, I turned around and became present with what was happening. And when I forgave, I created self-compassion. Because I wasn't trying to shoot blame or guilt anywhere in my life. That compassion brought me to the present moment of what was happening. But when guilt and blame were off the table, I was left with the stillness of vulnerability. There was no one left to blame. There was no guilt left to take on. And that vulnerability turned me inside out. It was so uncomfortable. I hated it. Because it was like I was exposed. I didn't want everyone to see my stuff. I wanted to go hide. I wanted to isolate. Each time I've experienced grief, all I want to do is be by myself because I didn't know how to process this pain. And I don't think anyone ever really knows how. We just have to learn to be still with it and become vulnerable. Because that vulnerability is going to help transform your grief into growth. That vulnerability of being willing to be still in the moment and let your emotions be in motion. It's so easy to grab a hold of that pain and say, this is who I am. This is my pain. This is my identity. Don't you know what I've gone through? Don't you know the emotional pain I've experienced in my life? You are not your pain. You are so much more than the emotional pain you've experienced in your life. And that's why vulnerability is so key in transforming that grief into growth, because we have to feel it all so we can let it go. And we have to be patient with ourselves for how long that takes. Because vulnerability is going to hit us when we're alone. It's a lot easier to distract ourselves. We got social media, we got Netflix, there's sex, there's drugs, there's anything that takes us out of feeling the vulnerability of our loss and our grief. And so I invite you to not fear it, to embrace it. Because each time I embraced it, even as scary as it was, because I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to feel that. But my fear was that if I don't feel it now, I might feel it later. So I surrendered to that vulnerability. And when I did that, I started to develop self-awareness. I started to know myself better than I ever did before, better than anyone else ever could. That vulnerability started to change me because I had emotional intelligence. I started to know myself. And I always knew that I would be talking about vulnerability in some way. I didn't realize that I'd be grieving while talking about it. I lost someone recently in a tragic accident. And I didn't know how much vulnerability it would take to talk about this while still grieving. And so my process of vulnerability today is by being here. Vulnerability as well for me is crying. I let it out. I welcome it. Vulnerability is sometimes dancing. Vulnerability is any form of expression that allows me to learn a little bit about myself, to not latch onto it, to not shun it, but to be an observer of it and letting it come and letting it go. And when I did that, I started to develop courage. Because if I can go through that emotional pain and let myself feel all of those feels, then what else can I do? Because that seemed like the scariest thing in my life. Losing the people that I love to the unknown. But that courage helped transform that grief into growth. Because of courage, I was able to travel the world. Because of courage, and because of the grief I got from that courage, some days it was just getting out of bed. It was something as simple as that. The courage depended on what I was experiencing. It didn't have to be some big monumental thing. But each of the big growing moments in my life always led back to grief and pain. And that emotion, being willing to go through the cycles of forgiveness, vulnerability, and courage. Grief is going to be inevitable. We are all going to experience it in one way or another, whether you already have or whether you're currently experiencing it or something in the future. You're going to experience it. But it doesn't have to define you, but you can use it as fuel to grow. And you can use those experiences to transform your life. If there's any takeaways that you have from this talk by listening of how to transform grief into growth, I hope it's that you don't have to stay stuck in your grief. And you can find relief in your emotions and in those griefs, and you can have happiness available to you in the midst of what you are experiencing. Thank you.